The moment a man realizes what he has lost is always the moment he finally sees it clearly, and for Ethan Cole, that moment came far too late. The ballroom glowed in soft gold, crystal chandeliers casting reflections across polished marble floors as the city's most powerful executives gathered for Cole Industries' annual gala, a place where million-dollar deals were whispered between sips of champagne and reputations were built or quietly erased, and at the center of it all stood Ethan, composed as ever, tailored suit flawless, posture sharp. The kind of man who controlled rooms without raising his voice, a man who believed everything. And everyone had a place, a function, a measurable value, and yet just a few feet away, unnoticed by him as always, Lily Carter adjusted the edge of a presentation board, her fingers steady despite the quiet tension in her chest, making sure every detail was perfect, because that's what she did. She fixed things, she completed things, she made things work, even when no one ever asked who made it possible. Mr. Cole will be presenting in 10 minutes. Someone called out, and Lily nodded softly, already stepping back into the background where she belonged, her presence blending into the movement of staff and assistants, invisible in a room she had helped build. Ethan walked past her without a glance, his attention fixed on a group of investors near the stage, his voice calm, measured, precise, discussing projections and expansion like it was second nature, like nothing in this room could surprise him anymore, like nothing here could matter beyond numbers. And for a long time, that had been true. Until another voice cut in, warm, confident, and unfamiliar. Actually, that growth model? It's impressive, but I'd love to meet the person who refined the logistics behind it. Ethan's expression didn't change immediately, but his eyes shifted slightly as he turned toward the speaker, Ryan Blake, the new investor everyone had been talking about, a man who didn't just look at numbers but at people, and before Ethan could respond, Ryan's gaze had already moved past him, landing somewhere behind his shoulder. "You," Ryan said gently, stepping forward, his tone not commanding but inviting. "You worked on this, didn't you?" Lily froze for half a second, caught between instinct and disbelief, her hand tightening slightly around the folder she held, because no one had ever asked her that before, not like this, not in front of everyone. "I just helped where I could," she replied quietly, her voice careful, as if stepping into unfamiliar space. Ryan smiled, not dismissive, not patronizing, just genuine. "Well, whoever you are, you didn't just help. You made it work." And then, without hesitation, he reached out, placing a light, reassuring hand at the small of her back as he guided her slightly forward into the conversation, a simple gesture, barely noticeable to most in the room, but to Ethan, it felt like something sharp and sudden cutting through the carefully controlled silence inside him. His fingers tightened around the glass in his hand, the faint clink of ice echoing louder than it should have, his jaw setting just slightly as his gaze locked onto the space between them, onto Lily, onto the way she stood there now, not invisible, not overlooked, but seen. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest, something he couldn't immediately name, because it wasn't anger, not exactly. And it wasn't pride either, it was something far more unsettling, the realization that someone else had noticed what he never had, that someone else had stepped into a space he didn't even know existed, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole didn't feel in control. Ethan did not remember walking away from the conversation, but suddenly he was standing near the edge of the ballroom, the noise around him fading into a dull hum as his eyes kept drifting back to the same point, to her. To the way Lily stood slightly closer to Ryan now, her posture still careful but different, less guarded, as if she had been pulled into a light she was not used to standing in, and for reasons he could not explain. That shift unsettled him more than any failed deal ever had. He had seen hundreds of employees come and go, had approved hires and terminations with the same steady hand, had built an empire by focusing on outcomes rather than individuals, because that was efficient. That was necessary, that was how you stayed on top. But now, as he watched Lily speak, really speak, not the quiet, brief answers he had overheard in passing before, but full sentences, thoughtful, confident, something in his memory began to stir, fragments of meetings, late-night reports, small corrections in presentations that had saved him from mistakes he never even realized he was about to make, and each memory carried the same name at the Bottom of the email, Lily Carter, a name he had read countless times without ever truly seeing. Across the room, Ryan laughed softly at something she said, leaning in just enough to show he was listening, really listening, and Lily's lips curved into a small, genuine smile, the kind that did not belong in boardrooms or corporate events, the kind that felt personal, unguarded, real, and Ethan felt something tighten again, sharper this time, less confusing, more intrusive, like a question he could not ignore any longer. Why had he never seen that before? Ethan! His assistant's voice broke through, clipboard in hand. It is time for your speech. He nodded automatically, his body moving before his thoughts caught up, stepping toward the stage as the lights subtly shifted to focus on him, the room quieting with practiced precision, all eyes turning to the man who had built coal industries into what it was today, and for a moment, everything felt familiar again, controlled, predictable, exactly how it should be, but then, as he reached the podium, his gaze flickered once more toward the crowd, and there she was, standing beside Ryan, no longer hidden behind others, no longer blending into the background, and it threw him off just enough that his usual opening line caught in his throat for half a second longer than it should have. Tonight, he began, his voice steady but not as effortless as before. We celebrate growth, resilience, and the people who make this company what it is. The words came easily, they always did, but as he continued, something about them felt hollow, like he was repeating a script that no longer fully applied, because for the first time, he was aware of someone in that room who had been part of that success without ever being acknowledged, and the realization sat heavy, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. He finished the speech to polite applause, the kind that filled the space but did not reach him, stepping down from the stage with a composed expression that hid the quiet shift happening beneath, and before he could stop himself, his feet were already moving in a direction he had not planned, toward her. Ryan noticed him first, offering a polite nod, but it was Lily's reaction that held Ethan's attention, the brief flicker of surprise in her eyes, followed quickly by the same professional calm she always carried when she spoke to him, as if nothing had changed, as if he had always seen her this way. Mr. Cole, she said softly. The formality of it landed harder than it should have, and for the first time, Ethan realized he did not like the distance in her voice, the space it created between them, the reminder that in her world, he was still just the boss who had never truly looked at her. He opened his mouth to say something, anything that might close that distance, but the words did not come as easily as numbers or strategies ever had, and in that brief silence, Ryan stepped in again, casual, confident. We were just talking about the logistics model. Lily explained it better than anyone I have met. Ethan's gaze shifted between them, something unspoken building beneath the surface, and this time when he looked at her, it was not as a passing presence or a line in a report, it was as someone he had overlooked for far too long, and the thought settled in with a quiet, undeniable weight. He had never noticed her, and now, someone else already had. The rest of the night moved forward as if nothing had changed, but for Ethan, everything had, and he could not shake the quiet awareness that followed him from one conversation to the next, from one handshake to another, because every time he spoke, every time he nodded at another executive or investor, his attention drifted back to the same thought, the same realization repeating in the background of his mind. Lily had always been there, and he had never once stopped to truly see her. By the time the gala ended and the last guests filtered out into the cool city night, the polished version of him had already begun to crack beneath the surface, replaced by something far less comfortable, something closer to doubt. The following morning, the office returned to its usual rhythm, clean lines, quiet efficiency, the low hum of productivity filling the open space. But Ethan noticed something immediately, something small yet impossible to ignore. Lily was not at her desk. It should not have mattered, people took days off, schedules shifted, but for reasons he did not want to examine too closely, he found himself pausing just a second longer as he walked past her empty chair, the neatly organized files still stacked exactly as she would have left them, everything in place except her. Where is Lily Carter today? He asked without looking up from his tablet, his tone neutral, controlled, but his assistant glanced at him with a brief flicker of surprise before responding. She is working remotely this morning. She has been doing that more often lately. More often. The words lingered longer than they should have, and for a moment, Ethan realized how little he knew about her, not just her schedule, but anything at all beyond the surface-level details buried in company records. He nodded once, dismissing the thought, or at least trying to, but as the day went on, something else became clear. Things were not running as smoothly as they usually did. A report came in with a small inconsistency that should have been caught before reaching his desk. A presentation draft lacked the subtle refinements that normally made it flawless. A client email went out with phrasing that felt just slightly off, not wrong, but not right either, and each time, Ethan found himself correcting it, adjusting it, stepping in where he never had to before, and slowly, almost reluctantly. A pattern began to form. These were the gaps Lily had always filled. By midday, his patience was thinner than usual, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could point to, but internally, the sense of control he relied on felt less stable, like something essential had been removed without warning. Across the office, he noticed Ryan again, standing near one of the conference rooms, speaking casually with a group of employees, his presence already blending into the culture in a way that felt effortless. And then, just as quickly, Ethan saw her, Lily, walking toward him with a folder in hand, her expression focused, composed, as if nothing about the previous night had changed her routine at all. Ryan smiled when he saw her, the kind of smile that acknowledged her, that welcomed her into the conversation without hesitation, and once again, that same quiet tension pulled tight inside Ethan's chest. He watched as Lily handed over the folder, explaining something with calm clarity, her voice steady, confident in a way he had never taken the time to hear before, and Ryan listened, really listened, asking questions, engaging with her as if her input carried weight, as if it mattered, and for the first time, Ethan saw the difference between hearing someone and actually seeing them. He stepped closer before he could reconsider, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic, the room growing just slightly more formal, more structured, as it always did when he entered, but this time, he did not speak right away. He simply stood there, observing, taking in the moment he had missed for far too long, and when Lily finally turned toward him, meeting his gaze, there was no hesitation in her eyes. No expectation either, just a quiet professionalism that made one thing painfully clear: she was used to him not noticing her, and she had learned how to exist without needing him to. That realization settled deeper than anything else, because it was not about losing control anymore. It was about understanding that he had never had it in the first place when it came to her. The rest of that moment lingered longer than it should have, stretching into something heavier as Ethan finally spoke, his voice measured but quieter than usual. "Walk me through it." And for a brief second, Lily hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because he had never asked her that before, not directly, not like she was the one holding the understanding instead of just supporting it from the background, and yet she responded with the same calm precision she always carried, explaining the figures, the projections, the small adjustments that made the difference between average and exceptional, her words clear, efficient, without the need to impress, because she had never been given a reason to perform, only to deliver. Ethan listened, really listened this time, and the more she spoke, the more something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could see, but enough that the silence he usually filled with authority now felt intentional, like he was finally making space for something he had ignored for too long. Ryan watched the exchange with quiet interest, his gaze moving between them, as if recognizing a change that Ethan himself had not fully grasped yet, and when Lily finished, there was a brief pause, one that felt different from all the pauses before, because this one carried expectation, not from her, but from him. "That should have been in the original report," Ethan said finally, his tone not critical, but thoughtful, almost reflective, and Lily nodded slightly. "It was," she replied simply, and the words landed with a subtle weight that did not need to be emphasized, because the implication was already there. It had been there, he had just never noticed. For a moment, no one spoke, and then Ryan broke the silence with an easy smile. "Then I guess we have been overlooking the right person." And the way he said it was light, almost casual, but it carried a truth that settled uncomfortably in Ethan's chest, because it was not just a statement, it was a mirror, reflecting something he could no longer ignore. The conversation moved on, as conversations always do, but Ethan found it harder to return to his usual rhythm, his focus disrupted by a growing awareness that extended beyond that single moment, because now, everywhere he looked, he began to see traces of her influence, small corrections in documents, streamlined processes, subtle improvements that had shaped the company's success in ways he had taken for granted, and the realization did not come all at once, it unfolded slowly, piece by piece, until it became impossible to dismiss. By late afternoon, he found himself doing something he rarely did, reviewing past reports, scrolling through months of work with a level of attention he usually reserved for high-stakes decisions, and there it was again, her name, over and over, attached to revisions, annotations, suggestions that had quietly elevated everything they touched, and with each discovery, the same thought returned, not sharp, not loud, but persistent. How had he missed this? Across the office, Lily moved through her tasks with the same steady focus, unaware of the shift happening behind the glass walls of his office, unaware that for the first time, he was not just looking at results, he was looking at her, at the consistency, the reliability, the quiet strength that had always been there without demanding recognition, and for reasons he could not fully explain. That realization did not feel like a simple correction, it felt like something deeper, something that unsettled the foundation of how he understood the people around him. As the sun began to dip behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the office floor, Ethan stood by the window, his reflection faint against the glass, his thoughts less structured than usual, less defined, because this was not a problem he could solve with logic alone, it was something else entirely, something unfamiliar, and as he glanced back toward the floor one more time, his gaze finding Lily again, he understood one thing with quiet clarity: noticing her now was not the same as having seen her all along, and whatever this was, whatever had begun to shift, it was not going to be as simple as catching up. By the end of the week, the shift was no longer subtle, it was everywhere, in the way meetings dragged just a little longer than they used to, in the way small issues surfaced that had never made it past the early stages before, and most of all, in the way Ethan found himself noticing the absence of something he had never consciously acknowledged before: Lily's quiet corrections, her invisible adjustments. The way she used to close gaps before they ever became visible problems. He sat in his office, reviewing a contract that should have been finalized hours ago, his pen hovering above the page as his eyes moved over the same paragraph for the third time. Something was off, not wrong enough to reject, but not right enough to approve, and that uncertainty irritated him more than any clear mistake ever could. He pressed the intercom without looking away from the document. "Send Lily Carter in." The words leaving his mouth before he had fully decided to say them, and for a brief moment, he paused, realizing this was the first time he had ever asked for her directly, not through a chain of assistants or revisions, but personally. A few minutes later there was a soft knock, followed by her voice, steady as always. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Cole?" He looked up, and for a second, the simplicity of the moment caught him off guard. No boardroom, no crowd, no external pressure, just the two of them in a quiet office, and suddenly, the space felt unfamiliar, like a conversation he had never learned how to have. "This clause?" he said, gesturing toward the document, keeping his tone controlled, professional. "Something about it feels incomplete." Lily stepped closer, her eyes scanning the page quickly, efficiently, and within seconds she pointed to a single line. "The risk allocation is unbalanced. It protects us in the short term, but it weakens our position if the timeline extends beyond 12 months. She did not hesitate, did not over-explain, just stated the issue as if it were obvious, and Ethan felt that same quiet shift again, the realization that what seemed unclear to him was something she had already resolved in her mind without effort. "Fix it," he said, the response automatic, but then he added, almost without thinking, "and walk me through your reasoning." The request lingered between them for a second, not because it was unusual in itself, but because it was unusual coming from him, and Lily nodded, explaining the adjustment with calm clarity, her voice steady, her logic precise, and for the first time, Ethan did not interrupt, did not redirect, he simply listened. When she finished, there was a brief silence, and then he said quietly, "You have been doing this for a while, have you not?" It was not really a question, more an acknowledgement, and Lily gave a small nod. Yes. No pride, no frustration, just a simple truth, and that simplicity hit harder than any accusation could have, because it meant she had never expected recognition in the first place. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked past the conference room and saw her again, sitting across from Ryan, the two of them reviewing a set of projections, their conversation easy, natural, the kind of exchange that did not require authority to function, and this time, the feeling that rose in him was clearer, sharper, no longer just confusion or discomfort, it was something closer to urgency. The sense that time was moving in a direction he could not control. He watched as Ryan leaned back slightly, listening with interest as Lily explained a detail, her expression more relaxed than he had ever seen it in his presence, and it struck him then, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet certainty, she was different around someone who saw her, and he had been the reason she had never needed to be that version of herself before. That thought did not sit well, not because it challenged his authority, but because it challenged something deeper, something personal, and for the first time, Ethan understood that this was no longer about efficiency or performance. It was about something he had overlooked, something he was only beginning to understand, and something he might already be too late to change. By the start of the next week, the distance between what Ethan had known and what he was beginning to understand had grown impossible to ignore, and it showed in small, uncharacteristic ways, in the extra minutes he spent reviewing details he used to trust others to handle, in the way his attention shifted more often toward the open floor instead of staying fixed on his own work, and most of all, in the quiet frustration that surfaced every time he saw the same pattern repeating itself. Lily no longer moved around him, she moved independently of him. That realization settled deeper when a new proposal landed on his desk, one that Ryan had personally recommended for immediate review, and attached to it was a note, brief but clear. Lily helped refine the execution model. "You should take a closer look." Ethan read the line twice, not because he did not understand it, but because of who it came from, and what it implied, that someone else had not only seen her value, but was now actively pointing it out, almost as if filling a gap Ethan had left behind. He opened the document, scanning the structure, the clarity, the subtle precision in how the risks were balanced against opportunity, and once again, it felt familiar, not because he had seen it before, but because he had missed it before, and that distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. Across the office, Lily stood near the window with Ryan, reviewing a timeline on a tablet, the light from outside catching the edges of her hair as she leaned slightly forward, focused, engaged, and this time, Ethan did not just notice her presence, he noticed the ease in her posture, the absence of the guarded distance she always carried when she was around him, and it struck him with a quiet clarity that had been building for days. She was not becoming someone new, she had always been this person, he had just never given her a reason to show it. He stepped out of his office before he could reconsider, his pace controlled but more deliberate than usual, and when he reached them, the conversation paused, Ryan offering a brief nod. "Ethan, we were just going over the rollout schedule." And Lily turned toward him, her expression professional, composed, the same expression she had worn for years, and suddenly, that consistency felt like a barrier he did not know how to cross. "I saw the proposal," he said, his voice steady, though something beneath it felt less certain. "It is strong." The pause before the last word was subtle, but it was there, and for someone like him, that hesitation meant more than a direct statement ever could. Lily nodded once. "Thank you." Simple, polite, nothing more, and for a brief moment, Ethan realized that acknowledgement, something he had never given before, did not change anything now, not in the way he expected it to. Ryan glanced between them, then added lightly, "We were actually discussing the possibility of expanding this into a new division." And the way he said it was intentional, not challenging, but inclusive, as if placing Lily's contribution at the center of the conversation without hesitation. Ethan's gaze shifted back to her, something tightening again, not the sharp confusion from before, but something steadier, more defined, a sense of urgency that was beginning to take shape, because for the first time, he could see the trajectory forming in front of him, opportunities opening, recognition growing, paths that did not necessarily include him. "Set up a meeting," Ethan said, his tone returning to its usual authority. But there was something different beneath it now, something less detached. "I want a full breakdown of the expansion plan." Lily nodded again, already stepping into action, her focus shifting seamlessly back to the task, and as she moved away, Ryan followed, continuing the discussion as if nothing had changed, as if this was already their rhythm, their dynamic, something established, something natural. Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching them walk across the floor, their conversation continuing without pause, and for the first time, the realization settled fully into place. This was no longer just about noticing her or correcting a mistake, it was about the fact that someone else had already stepped into the space he had left empty, and if he did not act soon, that space might never belong to him at all. The meeting was set for the following morning, a full strategic review in the largest conference room on the top floor, the kind of room where decisions shaped the future of the company, where every word carried weight, and for once, Ethan was not entirely sure how this one would unfold. He arrived early, as he always did, the room still quiet, the long glass table reflecting the skyline stretching across the horizon, but instead of reviewing notes, or refining his opening remarks, he found himself staring at the empty chair halfway down the table, the one reserved for Lily, and the thought settled in again, unfamiliar and persistent. This was not just another meeting, this was a moment he could not afford to mishandle. When the others began to arrive, the usual rhythm returned, voices low, laptops opening, documents spreading across the table, and then Lily walked in, followed closely by Ryan, the two of them already mid-conversation, their focus aligned, their dynamic easy in a way that stood out against the more formal atmosphere of the room. Ethan watched as she took her seat, not at the far end where she used to sit, but closer to the center now, her position reflecting a shift that had already begun without his input, and something about that detail tightened the sense of urgency he had been trying to control. The meeting started as expected, numbers, projections, timelines, each section moving forward with precision, but as the discussion turned toward the new division, Ryan leaned back slightly and said, "Lily, why do not you walk them through your model?" And just like that, the attention in the room shifted, not to Ethan, but to her. There was no hesitation this time, no pause. Lily stood, her voice steady as she began outlining the strategy, her explanations clear, structured, each point building on the last with a level of insight that commanded attention without demanding it, and as she spoke, the room followed, executives who normally directed the conversation now listening, asking questions, engaging with her directly, and for the first time, Ethan saw it not as an isolated moment, but as a pattern solidifying in real time. He tried to stay focused on the content, and objectively it was impressive, the kind of thinking that drove long-term success, but the more he listened, the harder it became to separate the work from the realization behind it, that she had always been capable of this, that she had always been this person, and he had simply never given her the space to be seen. "If we expand at this pace," Lily continued, gesturing to the projection on the screen, "we can maintain stability while scaling without overextending resources." And as she finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that followed something well said, something complete, and then Ryan nodded. "Exactly. Before." Turning toward Ethan. "What do you think?" The question was simple, direct, but it carried something more, an expectation, not just of approval, but of acknowledgement, and for a moment, Ethan felt the weight of every missed opportunity pressing against the present. His gaze moved from the screen to Lily, who was now watching him, not with anticipation, not with uncertainty, just with quiet professionalism, as if his opinion no longer held the same significance it once might have, and that realization hit harder than anything else. "It works," he said finally, his voice steady, controlled, but not as detached as before. "It is well structured." The words felt insufficient even as he said them, because they did not capture what he was beginning to understand, and for the first time, that limitation frustrated him. The meeting continued, decisions were made, next steps outlined, but for Ethan, the focus had already shifted beyond the surface of the discussion, because now it was clear she was no longer invisible, not to anyone in that room, and the more she was seen by others, the more undeniable it became. He had been the only one who had failed to see her all along, and now, standing in a room where her voice carried weight, he realized something with a clarity he could not ignore. Catching up was no longer enough, because the space he had left empty had already begun to fill without him. The room slowly emptied after the meeting, voices fading into distant conversations as people filtered out with notes and next steps. But Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than usual, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze fixed on the space where Lily had been standing just minutes ago, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel ahead of the situation, he felt behind it. By the time he stepped out into a hallway, she was already halfway down the corridor with Ryan, the two of them walking side by side, their discussion continuing as if the meeting had simply been one part of a much larger conversation, and something about that continuity unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant this was not temporary. It was not situational, it was a connection that extended beyond the structured environment he controlled. "Lily!" he called out, the word leaving his mouth before he had fully planned it, and both of them turned, her expression calm, his more curious, and for a brief second, the three of them stood in a silence that felt more personal than professional. "Do you have a minute?" Ethan added, his tone steady, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain, less rehearsed. Lily glanced at Ryan, a small, almost imperceptible exchange passing between them, and then she nodded. "Of course." Ryan gave a polite smile, stepping back slightly. "I will be in my office," he said, his tone easy, but the implication clear. He was giving them space, not because he had to, but because he could, and that detail did not escape Ethan. As Ryan walked away, the hallway seemed quieter, the usual office noise muted by the moment, and Ethan found himself facing Lily without the structure he relied on, without a meeting agenda or a defined objective, just a conversation he did not know how to start. "About the proposal," he began, defaulting to what was familiar, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew that was not what this was about, not really. Lily waited, her posture relaxed but attentive, giving him the space to continue, and that patience, that quiet steadiness, made it harder to stay within the safe boundaries of business. He exhaled slowly, something shifting as he chose his next words more carefully than usual. "You have been doing more than what your role requires." It was not a question, it was a statement, but it carried something heavier, something closer to an admission. Lily held his gaze for a second, then gave a small nod. "I try to make things work," she said, the same words she had used before, simple, consistent, and for a moment, Ethan realized how much those words had defined her presence in his company without him ever truly understanding them. "Why did you never say anything?" he asked, and this time, the question was real, not strategic, not calculated, just honest, and Lily's response came without hesitation, without emotion, just quiet clarity. "It was not my place." The answer landed harder than he expected, not because it was surprising, but because it was true, and it reflected something about the environment he had created, something he had never questioned before. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching into something that felt less like a pause and more like a turning point, and then Ethan said something he had never said to her before, something he had not even considered until now. "I should have seen it." The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as a grand apology, not as a dramatic confession, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something he could no longer ignore. Lily's expression did not change much, but there was a slight shift in her eyes, something softer, something that suggested she heard him, even if it did not change everything at once. "Maybe," she replied gently, "but you are seeing it now." It was not forgiveness, not entirely, but it was not rejection either, it was something in between, something that left space for what could come next, and as Ethan stood there, looking at her not as an employee, not as a function within his company, but as a person he had overlooked for far too long, he understood something with quiet certainty, This was the moment where everything could change. Or where he could lose her completely, and for the first time, the outcome was not something he could control with authority alone. The rest of that day moved forward with a quiet tension that no one else seemed to notice, but for Ethan, every moment felt sharper, more defined, as if he was finally seeing the structure of something he had overlooked for years, and by the time evening settled over the city, casting warm reflections across the glass walls of his office, he had already made a decision he would not have considered before. The following morning, a company-wide meeting was called, not unusual in itself, but unexpected in timing, and as employees gathered in the main conference space, a low murmur of curiosity filled the room, because Ethan Cole did not call meetings without a clear purpose. Lily stood near the back at first, out of habit more than intention, her posture composed, her expression neutral, but this time, Ethan noticed, and without hesitation he said, "Lily, come up here." His voice calm but carrying across the room with quiet authority, and for a brief second, the entire space stilled, attention shifting not just to him, but to her. She hesitated only slightly before stepping forward, moving through the crowd with the same steady presence she always carried, but this time, there was no place to blend into, no way to remain unseen. Ethan waited until she stood beside him, then turned to face the room, his gaze sweeping across the people who had trusted his leadership for years, and for the first time, his words were not about projections or growth, they were about something else entirely. "We talk a lot about success here," he began, his voice measured but different, less distant, more grounded. "About strategy, execution, results." He paused briefly, then continued. "But we do not always talk about the people behind those results." The shift in tone was subtle, but it carried weight, and the room grew quieter as he went on. "For a long time, I believed that if the outcome was strong, the process was enough," he said, his gaze steady. "I was wrong." The admission was simple, but it landed with a clarity that did not need emphasis, because it was not something he had ever said before. He turned slightly toward Lily, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence beside him. "This company is where it is today because of people who do more than what is asked, who see what others miss, who fix what is broken before it becomes visible." His voice held steady, but there was something beneath it now, something real. "And one of those people has been standing in this room for a long time without being seen the way she should have been." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with recognition as attention shifted fully to her, and for a moment, Lily stood there, still composed, still calm, but no longer invisible. "Lily Carter," Ethan said, her name clear, deliberate, "has shaped more of this company's success than most of you realize, including me." And this time, he did not look away from that truth. He held it, let it stand, let it be heard. There was a pause, and then, slowly, the room responded, not with loud celebration, but with something more meaningful, acknowledgement, respect, the kind that could not be forced or staged, and in that moment, the shift was complete, not just for her, but for him as well. When the meeting ended and people began to disperse, the energy in the room felt different, lighter in some ways, more grounded in others, and as Lily turned to leave, Ethan stepped closer, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "This is not a correction," he said quietly. "It is a beginning."